This talk and Q&A session with Ryan Graves is from an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon 2023, a conference which took place in New York City and online. If you enjoy this talk and would like to see more great talks from people like Christopher Mellon, Leslie Kean, and Gary Nolan, please feel free to subscribe to our channel for more excellent content currently and in the days ahead. And now, we bring you Ryan Graves.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here. My name is Ryan Graves. Thank you for that great introduction. And as it was alluded to, I spent about 11 years in the Navy as an F-18 pilot, among other duties. And I had some experiences during that led me to where I am today, in front of you fine folks, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But before I do so, we're all here because of this word anomalous and what that is. I think it's different for various people and their experiences, but I have had to explain why studying and looking at these things pragmatically is relevant to our decision makers and to our country. I want to share some of those insights with you, just briefly. One of the things I've noticed that when we look at these anomalies, they really highlight our frameworks that we've constructed for ourselves and that we think within, and sometimes not even knowing that we're doing so. So by putting attention and energy into these anomalous phenomena that we do observe, we kind of expose some of those existing frameworks that we operate in. Additionally, it provides us a unique opportunity to do actual innovative science that we otherwise would not have been able to do. We often get stuck inside of our current loops for science, and it takes really a new paradigm of thinking to shift outside and to explore the new boundaries. Those boundaries are often highlighted through anomalous behaviors that show up in the data. And often these experiences are very powerful to the individuals that have them and often change their life in various ways. I think by fostering that communication will make us all a little more empathetic to each other and be a little more, bring about a little bit of peace and clarity, I think, that we need in dealing with each other. So with that, there's one last point that I want to make when it comes to studying anomalous phenomenon. I think we're all a little bit perhaps more aware of it than we have been in the past. And that comes due to the national security and aviation safety concerns that arise out of this. As we've seen recently with the Chinese spy balloon that has traversed across the United States, if we're not looking for a particular thing, that's an opportunity for our adversaries to sneak something in and to observe us in ways that we haven't been paying attention to. And we have to know what's above our skies for national security and also for aviation safety. So I don't have a big background, I would say, with anomalous experiences, but some of you may know me from my time or my stories in 2014 and 2015. And what that was for me was generally just uncertainty that we had to deal with in our operating airspace. And we were observing those uncertainties through our radar systems initially. We had upgraded our radar from the APG-73 to the APG-79 radar, and that enabled us to see more of these objects, to see them at all on our radar systems. And initially, we thought this was due to the fact that there was some type of error. So for us, this wasn't necessarily, it was anomalous data, but it wasn't concerning data at this point. And so we didn't actually pay that much attention to it. Eventually, as our sensors would slew onto this particular area where our radar is dropping us off, we would observe correlation through the IR sensors that we have on our aircraft, such as the AT FLIR. And now we have another way of saying, hey, there's something here. And because we're seeing emissions from that spot, we would make the assumption that these are now physical objects that we had to respect, at least when we're operating in the airspace. At this point, some of the pilots, including myself, would attempt to fly up to these objects, considering we were able to monitor them quite securely and in a stable fashion on our aircraft systems. And because of that, we felt comfortable going up to 500 feet, which is our training limitations for close aboard passes, to try to get a visual of these objects. And we would slow down as much as possible in order to do so, to make the cross-tracking rate as little as possible so we could get the best look, of course. And in doing this, sadly, I was unable to actually gain a visual sighting of these objects. The radar would be showing me where it is, the FLIR would be showing me that something's there, and all that information would get pumped into my visor, which would track my eyes and show me where to look. And this is a procedure that we often do. And so, this was not a tactically challenging scenario for us, and yet we would not be able to see these objects. It wasn't until we had a near midair with one of these objects that we you really had to stop and assess how we were treating these from a safety perspective, an aviation safety perspective. 2 aircraft were entering our working areas at about 12,000 feet over a fixed GPS location that we've been using as a standard entry and exit point for those working areas. And as those 2 jets were approaching in a section format, about 150 feet apart, one of these objects traversed right between those 2 aircrafts. I believe it was the aircraft that was traversing past the object, which was stationary at that entry point for the area. But this was the first time we've had one of these objects not only come within 500 feet of our aircraft, but also do so unexpectedly. And that's how we essentially classify a near midair. And that's what they experienced. So at that point, they turned around, came back and landed. And that was the first time that we've had a description of what the object was. He was still in the ready room with his gear on. And he had a look of shock on his face. And he just said, "I almost hit one of those damn things." And we all knew what he was talking about, because at this point, we had been talking about them. We hadn't seen them with our eyes yet, but we knew it was a safety concern that we were actually briefing before each flight. And he described it, of course, as a dark gray or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. And for the most part, that's how it's been described to me from all the other pilots on the East Coast that had sufficiently powerful enough radars to see these. If they tracked them down and if they're able to see it, that's how they described it to me, at least. Now that we've done a FOIA request, and when I say we, I don't mean me, but the general public has done FOIA requests on the HAZREPs, or the hazard reports that were submitted because of these incidents, we could see that there were other shapes that were observed as well. But at least kind of person to person, we were only describing that particular shape. And in fact, if we fast forward now, we're still in 2014, but let's fast forward about 2019, 2020 actually. I had a student call me out. So I went to be a flight instructor in the Navy after I finished my combat tour with VFA 11. And I was teaching the next generation of fighter pilots how to do their job, essentially. Eventually, one of them grew up, got into the F-18, and was doing tactical flights off the Eastern Seaboard nearly 8 years after my initial experiences. And he called me up, told me that he was... he made it finally, and, all that was good, so congratulations. And he told me he was briefing a dogfighting fight with a senior person on base. And he was a relatively new pilot in the squadron, so it's customary for them to fly with a more senior person that might not be attached to the squadron. And this more senior person briefed that if the weather wasn't good enough to do the dogfighting that we need to do, then we'll go on a UFO hunt. Because at this point, it had been promulgated around and people understood that these were unknown objects. And, the joke was that these were UFOs or what have you. So let's, we'll go see if we can find some. So lo and behold, they end up going out on the flight, and the weather is what we call too skosh to actually do anything. And so they went and did their UFO hunt. And lo and behold, he called me because he said, "Hey, they're still out here. We saw the same object," and described it the exact same way about 8 years later. And so it's almost a generational issue for the aviators on the East Coast at this point. So that's how I essentially got involved in this. We were seeing these objects, and eventually, once we got to that point where we nearly had that midair, and I'm back in 2014 timeframe now, we left for our workup cycle. And what leaving means is that we went and flew aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and then we began our workup training off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. And it's during this event that we filmed the gimbal object, which was released by the U.S. Navy eventually, as well as the Go Fast video. 2 different members in my squadron that who saw it the first time were returning from an air-to-air combat training mission when they detected the objects on their radar. Their first assumption is it was a penetration test from the shore, which would often happen, although these objects were located east of the ship, which puts them somewhere in the city of 400 miles off the coast of Jacksonville at this point. They intercepted the aircraft, got within about 4 to 6 miles of the objects, and it was nighttime, so they go no closer. And now we've all seen the gimbal video. What we don't see on the video is the formation of objects which are flying nearby. And those objects, to our eye, appear to be similar to what we're seeing off the East Coast. And we make that assessment based off of how they would perform on the radar, how they would move on the radar, a bit jerky. So no conclusive evidence they were the same object, but Regardless, they were all unidentified at that point. And again, you've seen the videos from that. There is more data that comes along with that from that situational awareness page, which we hear the air crew mention. And that's really where all the data and radar information gets conglomerated into. So I wouldn't expect that information to come out, considering it's related to the radar. But regardless, that would be the mechanism to really get a good look at all the kinematics of the various objects that were airborne that day. So that was that. We left for deployment shortly afterwards. And rightly or wrongly, we really didn't think too much of it when we were out doing our business. We are pretty much working at the edge of our cognitive load when we're doing our combat operations. And so we would often see things that perhaps looked similar to what we had seen on the Eastern Seaboard, but we were unable to actually verify in any sense what they were. So in 2017, I saw a New York Times article come out. Some of you might be familiar with it. And right on the front page, essentially, was a video, a couple of them, that I recognized. A very strange moment of deja vu when I was like, holy smokes, those my buddies' voices. And so it took me actually longer than I probably admit, but I was like, those are the videos I saw, and, put all the pieces together. And when I realized the extent of the confusion within, quote unquote, the system to deal with this, that's kind of when I reached back and started talking to some of my colleagues that were on the East Coast. And I'm now fast forwarded to 2019. We left for our deployment. We came back. I'm now in that training tour. And I'm seeing in 2017 that article come out. And so I call back to my buddies that are still on the Eastern Seaboard, and I'm like, hey, is this still happening? Is this still going on? And sadly, the answer was yes, it was still going on, and it was still unmitigated. The only mitigation that was put into place was to have a notice to airmen, or a NOTAM, that was published in the working areas to warn people of unknown objects and to be wary of the potential hazard that they represented. And that was it. There was no real mechanism to report these. And in my perspective, that was, the point where I realized that this was the potential to be a major national security concern if these were potentially some type of foreign adversary that are drinking up our tactics and our electronic waveforms of all our sensors and X, Y, and Z. Or it's something else. And something else, we still need to pay attention to it because it's still a hazard for aircraft. We're canceling flights for this. We need to have the scientific integrity to actually figure out what it is instead of ignoring it. And so that's when I made the decision to reach out to whom I thought was responsible for releasing those videos at the time, which was the Two Stars Academy. And I just sent them an email asking if they'd like to talk about what else wasn't on the video. It was never my intent to mention anything classified, nor was any of this classified. But I felt that something had to be done outside the system, or else we're going to just continue in the same loop that we were still in. And sadly, in the Navy and, of course, the military in general, we typically write our procedures and our regulations in blood, which means we learn after the fact how an accident happens, and we prevent it by writing a procedure to change in the future. I see this as an opportunity to prevent that from happening, to prevent an aircraft from going down or taking one of these objects, again, regardless of what they are. Because the one thing we do know is that they're out there, and we're canceling training and other missions in order to avoid them. So once I had the opportunity to speak to various members of the government about what was going on and how potentially to fix it, I basically went back to my day job. But we're going to fast forward a little bit more, and we started identifying needs that could be accomplished in the public sector to help resolve the uncertainty that was there. Because at the point where I'm having this conversation with myself, there really was no government movement on this. It was still completely stigmatized within government, Capitol Hill, Department of Defense for the most part, at least from my perspective. But there was a drastic need to be able to bring the wider technology base of industry into the conversation. And so one of the ways that was done was by creating a committee within the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. There's now a UAP Integration Outreach Committee within that organization, and that's essentially a professional organization with 30,000 plus members across various air and space technical domains, everything from air-breathing rocketry to experimental propulsion to aircraft procedures and airframes, and everything in between. And so this organization is tasked with improving aerospace safety by exploring UAP and mitigating barriers to the understanding of UAP. And we have a number of efforts, both human factors and hardware factors related, that we're using to assess our ability to detect these objects and in what time frames and distance from aircrafts, and how we can implement that into a new reporting mechanism and procedures that will be implemented and potentially made mandatory across the U.S. reporting systems, both commercially and within the Department of Defense. And we're helping to provide recommendations on where those reports would land, what systems could be used, and how to analyze the data afterwards, of course. There's another need that has recently been identified as well, and that's with the Americans for Safe Aerospace. There hasn't been a lot of, much of a UAP caucus, you could say, on Capitol Hill. And there was a very big concern that pending an election or something of that nature, the interest in this topic could potentially go away. And so I've helped start recently Americans for Safe Aerospace. We'll be doing public education. We'll be doing education with decision makers on Capitol Hill, providing policy and legislative recommendations that could be, in some cases, I think, beneficial and provide protections that we haven't been seeing as of yet. And so, for example, some of the progress that's been made lately with the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 provided whistleblower protections for people within the defense industry and elsewhere to report on historical programs that were not properly reported, among many other parameters inside of that bill. But what's not mentioned is any type of mandatory reporting or protections for aviators or commercial pilots. And so these are some of the policies and procedures that we want to implement through ASA, through the American for Safe Aerospace, so that we can open up the reporting, ensure that any remaining stigma that's preventing the data from being collected on the commercial, general aviation, or DoD will go away due to the mandatory requirements. Check my notes real quick. All right. And how am I doing on time? Good. So, yeah, let me finish up here. I just want to talk about a little, some misconceptions, perhaps, that I've also had to clear up in the public. And often we hear when engaging with people, their first reaction to any type of statement or data is to immediately draw a conclusion that they disagree with. So one of the things I always strive and encourage is for us to not necessarily feel like we need to draw ourselves to a conclusion immediately. We need to be able to be comfortable in that uncertainty and allow ourselves to live there and to foster the learning that's going to occur there. If we jump ourselves to conclusions, we're going to find ourselves beholden to the assumptions that come with those, and we're going to find ourselves, I think, on the wrong path. So as I go through this process myself, I try to approach this very much from a first principles perspective, assuming I know nothing, which is an easy assumption for me to make. And I approach it from that way. So I encourage others to be able to be comfortable in that period of uncertainty that I now seem to live in. And the last thing I wanted to say, well, a few things here, but by allowing ourselves to sit with that discomfort, not having the immediate answers, we create the space, I think, for the curiosity and for that innovation that we need. And if we don't leave that space there, we're just not going to be able to find it. So with that, I'll encourage all of you to stay informed on this topic, stay curious on this topic, to realize it's a pragmatic issue, at least for some people, and that there are real methods and engineering and solutions that can be applied to this problem to bring more information and data and learning to it. So stay curious, stay informed, and I believe that truly understanding this can result in a deeper connection to the world around us, foster empathy, creativity, and a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of life. Thank you.
I just want to make a quick announcement before you do question and answer. If anybody is on the Wi-Fi, please turn off the Wi-Fi. We're having some connection issues, and so if you've somehow gotten on the Wi-Fi, please get off the Wi-Fi as soon as humanly possible, like right now.
Any questions in the audience? Hello. I'm interested in the consciousness connection with these device ET people, whatever the case may be. And it's my experience that those who have seen these craft tend to see these craft more often than those who haven't. It's almost like one side and begets the next. And I'm curious if anyone's done a retrospective analysis of the people who are routinely flying, be they commercial or in the military, who see these things, because it's likely that, there's some who characteristic. That's my first thought is, if you had a group of these people in the air in a single unit, would you be able to attack these things? And secondarily, I think it'd be interesting to get a group of these people on the ground doing something like a C-5. But I guess really I'm curious, has there been a consciousness correlation even?
Yeah. I'm not aware of one. I'm not aware of a study that has been done on that either. Now, we're not necessarily addressing consciousness directly, but we do have cognitive scientists and other people that are trained to get with that first principle approach of working directly with air crew and astronauts to develop new procedures. And so while going through that process, parameters are going to be developed, cohorts are going to be devised, and that could potentially be data that falls out if there are repeat observations and things of that nature. So there's a potential to gather that data in the future, but none of it exists as far as I'm aware at this point.
Hey Ryan, long time no see. I know that 2017 is kind of considered like the 0 point of all of this. I wonder if there's anything. I know on your platform you interview pilots and things like that. Is there anything being done to comb through the records and possibly see if anyone's still around that can maybe describe a sighting that was investigated from the archive, from like maybe from the 40s on all the way up until the 90s and 2000s now, but specifically when we've had waves like in 47, 52, and so forth?
I want to make sure I understood the question, but you're asking, is the opportunity exists to interview people that have experienced those things from a more historical context? Yeah.
Basically pre-2017, where everyone knows well, nobody really talks about all the sightings that pilots have had, in certain military factions up until then. So is there anything being done to like maybe comb through the archives and find out if anyone's willing to talk about those experiences?
Well, if anyone wants to volunteer as my researcher, I'd appreciate it. But I have been looking for some pilots like that until I really would actually need someone like that. But no, I have been looking for some, and it's tough because you run into different barriers. People don't want to talk about it anymore. Perhaps people have passed away. I've run into those roadblocks. So I'm absolutely interested in having those conversations. It's a harder get for me right now. And so to my joke earlier, if anyone, has a hot lead on that, I'd be all ears.
I just wanted to know if you had any input on
Who's that? Oh, there you go. Sorry.
the recent incidents that are balloons that, now obviously they're using UAP for the terminology, but it became very quiet after that, and there's no information coming out, even though we know one prior to the quiet was a balloon. Nothing is coming out on anything else.
Yes, that is strange, isn't it? So we have the quote-unquote Chinese balloon that we identified and saw and looked pretty recognizable, I would say. And then we have the mysterious 3 other objects that are definitely not balloons, but they're objects, but we don't know what they are, but we're not going to show you. And we don't know where they are either now. So all that's very strange, but all that to say that we just don't know, right? I would imagine that there's very likely... From the information I've seen, they appear to be mostly drifting in the wind. They seem to be behaving balloon-like kinematics and things of that nature, with perhaps some small mobility. But that's all fine and well and good. And I think there could be perhaps some correlation issues within NORAD and a little overexcitement, which is causing them to shoot down these multiple objects. That would be my first inclination. But with that being said, I do think there have been some interesting descriptions of at least some of the objects that were shot down. or at least one of the objects. But again, we're not going to know, unfortunately, until we seem to get told something in this regard. So it's strange. I don't have anything to tell you that is going to, I think, solve it for you. But my big plug when I talk about this is that we're seeing things that are balloons. We're seeing things that are pretty highly observable and easy to identify and see and have those balloon-like entities. But there are more things that are out there that we're seeing on our systems that aren't necessarily related, but go to the point that there are things up there that we need to properly calibrate our systems to be able to see.
Thank you for your service, sir. And I wanted to ask, frequency of, we often hear about, especially the naval incidents, but do you have any idea if the over-land incidents that occur are near the frequency that are occurring over the oceans or in the oceans?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. The stories I've heard of people observing these over land do exist, but they're less consistent and not necessarily in the same place all the time. So I don't know if that's observation bias or whether that's truly because it's happening less. Because at least in my particular case, we typically operate over the ocean, and we were seeing them only over the ocean. With that being said, there has been some anecdotal data at other training ranges and that are landlocked, you could say.
Sort of step off that, have you experienced, or does anyone experience any unusual underwater activity like we've been hearing about recently at night or something right after that?
So not directly. I've heard some stories from people that operate in that domain professionally in the military, and more so lately. So there are some interesting data points there. But when we're operational as F-18 guys, that's just, we don't have the tools to see that, essentially. So all that would look like is something being near the water and then it not being there on our radar, at least. So we don't really have the tools to tell what's underwater.
Hello. Hi. Well, pardon me. I just wanted to clarify, when you said that you were in the cockpit and your radar was guiding your eyes to the point where this thing should be seen, and yet you don't see it. You didn't see it. Are you implying that it was invisible but physical, and it should have been seen but was not?
I'm not necessarily implying anything. I'm telling you the data as I have it, and how that gets connected. I leave to you guys, sadly, because I don't want to put my assumptions into it. But we would turn around and we would see the objects on multiple sensors correlate at the exact same location on IR sensors and radar sensors. So I can't definitively say that that means they were physical but not visible, right? Or that they even all represented physical objects necessarily, right? That has to be on the table as well. But yeah, I don't know how to connect those for you. That's just the data I have to give.
Okay.
Hi, I know that I'm speaking on behalf of thousands of us, but how much we appreciate you in the field. The day that I saw you on 60 Minutes was a moment I've been waiting nearly 30 years for. So.
Thank you, James.
There's one aspect of, I think it was after the gimbal, or maybe it was Go Fast. You guys had sort of a debrief and showed this footage where you had an animal come on. Take a look. Can you describe that scene for us? Because it's rather telling.
Yeah, your mic's going out a little bit, but so what James is referring to is, as I mentioned, the evening that the gimbal video and the Go Fast video were captured on video. Once we all got back to the boat, I was in the ready room. The aircraft that actually recorded the tape, as is procedure, their weapons system officer went to Civic, which is an intelligence debriefing space on the boat. And in this particular case, the pilot went with him because there was something cool to see. And someone told me that, and that's why I went from the ready room down there to take a peek as well. And that's primarily where I am when I talk about the V formation or the gimbal and how it's behaving. It's from my viewing of the situational awareness page inside of that room, as well as the FLIR footage as well. So I I go in there, all of the, there's several air crew that are kind of huddled up around the computer, basically asking, what the F is this? And probably 7 or 8 Intel folks that are all trying to gather around, take a peek as well. It was clearly anomalous. There, it clearly wasn't something anyone knew what it was. It was immediately confusing to everyone. And I heard the admiral was coming down to take a look at the tapes. So I kind of slinked back into the back corner of the room a little bit so I could try to see his reaction to the video, try to see if that could be helpful. He came down, he watched the tape for 6 or 7 seconds or so. He turned around, left, and didn't even watch the whole video, which blew my mind. You wouldn't even watch the whole thing. And that was that. And from my perspective, I interpreted that as his having seen that or being aware of the issue at this point. If we fast forward a few years, after talking through some folks on the inside through the work that I had done, I was basically told that my perception was correct, and that immediately after that, he went in to basically report back that these things are still over his aircraft carrier, and what should he do about it. And in fact, I just had a conversation just the other day to learn something new, which was an admiral that I've been speaking to recently informed me about an email that was sent from the operations team, essentially from the aircraft carrier that night, that evening, to basically say if anyone is operating, drones that shouldn't be out here, has basically a mass blast at anyone operating on the East Coast. So kind of interesting perspective I just learned just the other day about how the wheels were turning behind the scenes operationally to try to figure out what was going on a little bit. So,
right. And got one more question, and I've got a big one from the live stream. Almost. Did any of the UAPs your unit observed ascend rapidly out of the atmosphere?
Out of the atmosphere or into the atmosphere? But we don't necessarily look to very high altitudes all the time. So we have a scan volume, and things would be in the scan volume essentially. So we weren't necessarily seeing them just kind of departing from high altitudes down to our operating altitudes. They were always just there to begin with. When they did transit altitudes, it was typically within that block that we could see, and it was never in this, instantaneous type movement. It was kind of more meandering. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody else.
Are you briefing people in Washington? And if you are, what's the pulse of that?
I want to say briefing, but speaking, and to my point earlier, I think it's a little bit of a growing caucus and increased interest, and people I think see the importance of the domain awareness gap that this represents, regardless of their beliefs and what this could be.
Wonderful. Okay, that's our time.
Thank you.